the larger global context within which we must see India and China's relationship.
In 1924, Tagore goes to China. By Gitanjali, 1912, his work already starts getting published in China. They're not just translating Tagore, they're writing poems about him. He's already a phenomenon.
China's rise as a technological society in tandem with a broader global paradigm shift related to tech, whether it's AI, quantum computing, so forth and so on, is that the best science we have suggests, for example, that the pandemic was caused by climate change.
Welcome everyone to this discussion on India, China in the larger global context today. I have with me Vijay Prasad, who needs no introduction to this audience, particularly as he claims he is from Calcutta and still would like to regard that as his home city, even if he's in exile at the moment. So among the various things, he is also director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Research. But as you know, we think of globetrotter Vijay Prasad, who is into various things. And we get a little tired of finding out that by the time we have caught up and known where he is now in another place. Right now, he's speaking to us from South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa. We have Gregory Mahoney, Professor Gregory Mahoney, who is in politics and international relations in East China Normal University. He is also associated with other research institutions and other universities. So all of you have written books. So I'm going to ask my audience that they should really find out all the things that you have written and get to know the subjects better. But let me start with asking Vijay Prasad to talk about the larger global context within which we must see India and China's relationship. Of course, both of these countries, India and China, have been much older civilizational centers. Both were subjugated in different ways by colonial powers, one as a direct colony by the British, and China as what itself termed as a semi-colony, which was really preyed upon by a number of colonial powers, particularly after the naval battles which they lost with the European powers, the kind of treaties that were imposed, the kind of relationships that the European powers, also the United States, imposed on China for about 100 years. So when we are talking about this, we also should be talking about how the world is changing, particularly when I think about it, that what started as 500 years, roughly 500 years of West European colonizing of the world, turning the terms of relationship between nations, terms of trade, into one of colonial expansion, undergirded by essentially genocide, loot, slavery. These are the three characteristics of the colonial expansion that takes place starting with 1492, essentially being the starting point in that sense. First, the devastation of the Americas, its resettling by the settler colonialism, and of course, the subjugation of Asia and Africa. So with this basic, shall we say, my framing, uh, we are really talking about reworking those relationships. And recently, with what Mr. Trump has done, it seems that he has decided that the so called consensus of G7, that they will decide what the global rules are, what the civilized rules of nations interacting should be, has now given away to essentially something which resembles old style loot, robbery in guise of trade, in guise of tariff discussions, but behind that, the armed fist of the United States. This seems to be the path that Mr. Trump has chosen. So the global consensus led by G7 seems to have been buried. And of course, if it wasn't buried by Mr. Trump, the Palestinian struggle right now, what's happening in Gaza, the genocide of Gaza would have buried it, that these countries are in any sense wearing the mantle of civilized nations. The fact that they are complicit in various ways, after 600 days, almost 600 days, they're starting to speak a little about it, sotto voce, making some noises, but no concrete action as yet. So, with this background, Vijay, I'm sorry to have stolen some of what you might have been wanting to say. Can I ask you to start that within this framing, how do you see the global relationships itself? Because India-China relationships cannot be taken in isolation or in a vacuum. And also then look at how India and China, how its relationships are emerging, difficult relationships, lot of tensions between them, but at the same time, they also still are talking to each other and they still are in the BRICS and seem on certain issues to have a commonality of viewpoint regarding the reworking of the global relations, particularly the economic and the monetary relationships. So, with that, can I ask you to go first?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to start somewhere slightly different. Um, Over 100 years ago, in 1924, Tagore goes to China. By Gitanjali, 1912, his work already starts getting published in China. There's a lot of debate and dispute about his poetry. Some of the most well-known or highly regarded poets of that era write poems about him. Actually, it's quite interesting. They're not just translating Tagore, they're writing poems about him. He's already a phenomena. And I think in India, we don't have much of a very strong understanding of the impact that Tagore had in China in 1924. He goes to China, he gives a series of lectures on nationalism. It's very critical of what he thinks of as the emergent of hostile or xenophobic nationalism. Goes to Tokyo, attacks the idea of European nationalism, says that this form of nationalism, which undercuts the kind of universalism of old civilizations, might lead to war and militarism, further war. In fact, he's able to anticipate the emergence of Japanese fascism. And those essays or those talks are put together in a book called Nationalism, which is one of his most well-regarded books. It's the 100th anniversary of that book, and it's an important book to go back to because there are three lectures in it. One on nationalism in Europe, European nationalism, one Japan, one China, and then a last section on India, where he's sort of warning and saying Indian nationalism shouldn't follow the European and Japanese way, but India and China should develop a nationalism that is capacious, that is capable of being internationalist, of being universal. And he goes back and says, we have a great civilization, and so on. 70 years ago was the Bandung Conference, where India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Chou En-lai, and others were in Bandung in Indonesia, where some of these ideas of Tagore this capacious sense of anti-colonial nationalism gets picked up. Because if you read, the first draft of this is the Panchashila or the Panchshil, the 5 principles of mutual coexistence. And then by the time the Chinese add some things to it, it's the Dasashila or the 10 principles of peaceful coexistence. And then if you read what comes out of it, which is the Bandung Communique, it's very well worth reading again. You can see that they are adopting this idea of a kind of anti narrow nationalist internationalism, or rather an internationalist nationalism, not a narrow one that led into Japanese fascism or the fascisms in Europe. And so this is part of our heritage. 70 years ago, Zhou Enlai and Nehru were there. We seem to have covered over this heritage through the border clash in 1962 between India and China, as if that earlier heritage has been rendered irrelevant, which it has not. It needs to be picked up again. Once again, we are under the temptation, if I may, which Tagore warned about, the temptation of going down the track of somebody else's problem. United States certainly seems to have a problem with China. Not sure that China has a real problem with the United States, but certainly the US has a problem with China. It's imposing a problem not only on China, but on the whole world. In fact, it's demanding that countries around the world pick sides. I'm not really sure that this is a view that the Chinese would like to adopt, which is that to mirror this US anxiety, very much like the kind of European nationalism that Tagore warned people in Asia about in the 1920s. What is the problem that the US has with China? It's pretty straightforward. United States miscalculated after the fall of the Soviet Union, arrogantly deciding, well, we now control intellectual property rights. We've changed the nature of intellectual property law. We're going to export industry. We are not worried about that. We'll let the Chinese produce goods and we'll let others produce services. We'll do business process outsourcing. We'll outsource industry. We might even allow them to have a look at our patents or how to make things and so on. And then the US was busy trying to idealistically change the world through war. These were two of its basically foreign policy maneuvers. Let's export our industry, let somebody else produce it. We'll be busy overthrowing governments in Iraq and so on, and then idealistically transforming the whole world into the United States. That was a severe miscalculation, because what they ended up doing was weakening the United States. The United States' ability to, in fact, raise revenue for building infrastructure and industry within the United States is very limited. The private sector uninterested in long-term investment, and they effectively exported industry epicenter somewhere in Asia. Let's say somewhere between China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, a little bit Indonesia, and so on. Okay, so after having miscalculated, there's a sudden realization, goodness me, they are producing all the goods and some of the services, and our big tech companies are being outflanked. So what should the United States do in response? Well, if you follow the principles of free market capitalism, invest in your own country or in proximate countries, start producing cheaper goods and services or better quality goods and services, and try to outcompete the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and others. Well, but that's too much work. Much easier to use the military, which has been well built up, to intimidate countries and try to enforce a surrender so that they would backtrack. Now, this policy worked for the United States against Japan in 1985 with the Plaza Accord, and then in 1995 with the Reverse Plaza. But the Chinese refused to upwardly value the renminbi, refused to basically fiddle with their currency to advantage the United States. But they said, why should we do that? You why should we artificially surrender to you? That's like allowing the opium that the British were imposing on India. By the way, opium, some of it brokered through Rabindranath Tagore's father and grandfather, because they play a role in the opium trade as well. The old man wasn't entirely immune from that history of subjugation, but still, the Chinese say, we don't want another century of humiliation. We're not going to go for it. So the United States trying to carol countries around China, Japan. Anyway, Japan, almost a vassal state of the United States. Australia, they've sort of lost their mind. Their largest trading partner both ways is China, and yet they are trying to subjugate China. Don't quite understand what they are up to in Australia, but anyway, they corral these countries into initially the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. India goes along with it. Now, interestingly, India seems to have lost interest in that, which is why the United States created the Squad, where they replaced India with the Philippines. I mean, they could have just expanded the Quad, added the Philippines in, but they didn't. They made a new platform because it seems that there's been a kind of softening on the Indian side. I think some of it is indicated by the 85,000 visas that the Chinese government have given Indian nationals since the 1st of January of this year. And India is trying to reciprocate, not fast enough, but trying to open up some visas. So the US is trying to impose this new Cold War on much of the world, basically trying to settle a parochial problem by making it universal. It's a parochial problem. It impacts US multinational corporations. I do see the problem. I mean, they have a real problem. Trump is not unusual here. He's following what before him Biden had done, before Biden Obama had done, or rather Trump, and then before that Obama. I mean, this is not some unusual idiosyncratic policy coming out of Trump's head. This has been US ruling class policy since at least 2011 with Obama's pivot to Asia. It was a dawning realization that the US has miscalculated and they have a problem. It's a parochial problem, but it's a problem. It's their problem. Since then, they've been imposing their problems. Classic, colonial strategy. You make your own parochial problem a universal problem. They forced the Europeans onto their bandwagon. Germany, stupidly. Most German manufacturing takes place inside China. I mean, Hubei province is the center of, it's a Ruhr Valley of Germany. The new Ruhr Valley is in China. And yet, they have been pushed into making all kinds of inadequate policies regarding China. I mean, I've been, plugging through Angela Merkel's memoir, at least the parts later in her life, although the parts of her early life are very interesting, but the parts later in her life, and it's fascinating. Angela Merkel basically understood that Germany had to tie itself to Chinese manufacturing, and this is being reversed by lesser chancellors that followed her, Olaf Scholz first, and now Mr. Merz, lesser chancellors than Angela Merkel, because she understood the nature of human history. And this is something that these others are not able to understand. They think that the United States is still the biggest dog in the kennel. And so they've gone with their tails between their legs across the Atlantic again and tried to turn their backs on what's happening in Asia. Again, it's important that this is not just happening in China. The epicenter is certainly China, but this shift in the epicenter or the geography of industry, it's not just China. It includes a number of other countries, including India, which for all its problems, and there are many, and I'm sure Prabir you'll talk about some of them, is still a place that is much more able to produce certain goods and services at a cheaper price than the Atlantic world. So in a sense, the global problem is a problem of this parochial real crisis faced by the United States, which they're imposing on the rest of the world. And much of the world, particularly the vassal states of the US, or the very close vassal states, are going along with this US policy. But others are sort of uneasy about it. And this is the reason why it's important to look at the BRICS very soberly. The BRICS emerges after the credit crisis of 2007. The BRICS is not a political project in 2009. It's largely a commercial project in 2009. These countries come to the slow realization, United States, Europe, not going to be the buyer of last resort. They start to revive the old 1970s slogan of South-South cooperation. And you basically have South-South trade expanding. The numbers are quite dramatic for many countries. Between South Africa, Brazil, India, the trade in pharmaceuticals predates the creation of BRICS. These countries create IBSA in 2003. That's India, Brazil, South Africa. But with the expansion of China and Russia, and then the BRICS Plus, the trading universe of this world has increased quite dramatically. And the Belt and Road Initiative 2013 basically follows on what the BRICS paradigm had been. Now, obviously, certain political things have been put on the table subsequent to that, for instance, UN reform and so on, but it's still largely a trade and development project, which includes some financial aspects, although those are extremely slow. And finally, the final point is that, the most difficult transformation is not actually in terms of increasing bilateral trade or even shifting the locus of development financing and so on. That's not the most difficult thing. The most difficult thing with which we've been struggling for over a century is to sort of get colonial thinking out of our brains. That's the most difficult. This idea that the best goods and services come from the West and so on. Give you an example. About 12 years ago, I was doing a story on India-Iran trade and was talking to the Iranians about the fact that Iran was selling India oil and taking payment in rupees. These rupees were being gathered in the State Bank of India in Calcutta in a bank account. And there was an enormous surplus of Indian rupees, which the Iranians owned, sitting in an Indian bank. So I asked them in Iran, why don't you buy Indian things with that? For instance, wheat, which you are a net importer of wheat. Why don't you buy Indian wheat? And they said, no, we are okay with our wheat purchases. We're looking at so where does Iran buy its wheat from? Well, it buys wheat from the United States. Despite the attack by the US, there's an idea in Iran that American wheat, grown in the plains of the Midwest is a better quality. To get colonialism out of the brain, and that's really what Tagore is talking about when he goes to China in 1924, and then when his book Nationalism comes out. To get colonialism out of the brain is very, very complicated. It's very difficult. To get India to understand, or the Indian people, that China is not your enemy is very difficult to do. These border crises, these are all solvable. There's no intractable problem between India and China. Just to get the idea out of the brain that China is your enemy is difficult. And similarly, within China, to get the idea out that Indian goods and services are mediocre, is going to take time. We struggle and suffer with the taproot of culture, which goes so deep and needs so much work to transform. But hopefully that is going to happen in our lifetimes.
Vijay has given us an overview of the last 100 years and not of the last 500 years, which is what I was talking about. And I think that's good, because maybe too large a framing removes the focus. So, Professor Mahoney, on to you for looking at the problem, whichever framing you want to use: China, the United States, China, India, China and the globe, or just the global framework.
Well, let's start with, as a Marxist historicist, I'm going to be inclined to look at it from a broader perspective, but certainly from a Chinese point of view, in so much as I've been living in China for the last 15 years, have started coming here in the late 90s, and am now settled here, and my expertise is centered here. So that's what I can speak best to. But I think to begin with the immediate moment, as President Xi, or to use the term that he uses, that we are living in a new era. Now, I would go on to describe this new era in ways that I think are in tandem with what he says. But the words I would use would be that we're living in an era of intersecting singularities. These singularities include the imperial entropy and decline of the United States, China's rise as a technological society, in tandem with a broader global paradigm shift related to tech, whether it's AI, quantum computing, so forth and so on. Relatedly, the emergence of a multipolar world, climate change, the rise of the global south, as well as a number of black swan events like the pandemic. And certainly, from whether we're looking at this from a Taoist or a Marxist perspective, all of these things have a link. They're all part of the same reality, and they're all having some cause and effect relationships with each other. So to speak to the first point, as a Marxist, I believe that we are seeing a number of the accelerating crises associated with capitalism, first theorized substantially by Marx. Certainly things have changed through time, but nevertheless, I would date those as really becoming apparent and accelerating in the 1970s. At that time, we saw, of course, the United States undertaking a number of changes that would lead ultimately to the reinvigoration of the American model vis-a-vis the Reagan Revolution, or whatever you want to call it, which of course left the U.S. more vulnerable to financial crises, as well as inclined to hollow itself out, as it started doing with its own manufacturing, as it started neglecting its own infrastructure investments, as it started seeing this decline in the well-being of the working and middle classes. So we've seen this long-running decline of the United States going back at least to the 1970s. At the same time, we also saw the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, doubling down on its own paradigm in the late 1970s, also not working out very well for the Soviet Union. However, at around the same time, we saw China undertaking a very radical change, a tactical shift. And although we generally associate this tactical shift in the literature almost exclusively with Deng Xiaoping, one of the things that we neglect is that it was substantially Mao Zedong who set the table for Deng, in so much as it was Mao who opened the door to Nixon and Kissinger, who strategically moved China in a position so that it would be able to advance in that direction. And we see this happening as early as late 68 or early 69, where many, I think, around the world tend to mistake that as the period of cultural revolution excess. There's a strange dialectic at work there where China is actually positioning itself for a very different future. And I think if we go back and we look carefully, and I've done this in some of my works, look carefully at what China was thinking about in the 1960s and playing forward what was coming down the pike, we'll see that they were thinking very strategically, and at least putting in place some pieces that would be able to move in ways that would suit what they viewed as the Soviet decline, the eventual Soviet decline, and the fact that at some point in the future they'd have to stand toe-to-toe with the United States, and would have to do so hopefully on even terms. We have seen another point that I would make here to go back to one of the things I said is China's rise as a technological society. This is something I've written about, and I've argued that China today should be regarded as the world's foremost technological society. This isn't to say that it has the most advanced technologies or that it has the most advanced basic sciences, although in many areas it is competitive, and in some areas it is leading. But more to the point, the way China works, the way the government, the people, the industry, the universities, the way everything works together as a society to solve major problems. We can see this or understand this in terms of raising 800 million people out of poverty, or we can look more recently at China's unequaled response to the pandemic. This is something that I think has demonstrated this capacity to deal with problems and to provide solutions that ultimately the majority of the people in China accept as being progressive. Now, the next point here is that the issue of climate change as a singularity. And this is something that certainly eco-Marxists have focused on. It's become an increasing focus in my own work. A year and a half ago, I was in Ukraine doing field work. And my thesis there was that what we were seeing was a proxy war between two fossil fuel dependent economies fighting over control of energy markets and how energy is paid for. That thesis resonated with most of the people that I spoke with in Ukraine itself. Of course, it's taboo in the US and in Europe, but no one in Ukraine seemed to have a problem with it. But what we're talking about then would be two countries of the global north, both the United States and Russia, which do depend on oil for their economic well-being, or the extent to which the US can still exert some control over the global financial system, in so much as the dollar is still the global reserve currency. And given the dollar's close relationship with oil and the fact that under Biden, the US consolidated its position as the world leading petroleum producer when Biden took the step that none of his predecessors, even those who were much less friendly to the environment than he claimed to be, by opening once sacrosanct lands in Alaska to more drilling. So the concern that I have is that we see these countries in the global north playing a strategic end game, not only with each other, but with the global south. Now, in so much as some countries in the global north will suffer from climate change, relatively speaking, we anticipate the global south will be impacted much more. And the number one country right now, according to most estimates in terms of people and fixed investments exposed, would be China, with 3 of the top 5 places in the world in China itself: Shandong, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Guangdong. Again, in terms of population and fixed investment at risk. Now, China is facing risk from the sea, but also being hollowed out by desertification, something that starts in Africa and moves all the way across Central Asia. So this is indeed something that we have to think more carefully about. And it is one of the reasons why China has emerged as one of the leading countries, maybe the leading country in green innovation and development, not simply because this is a popular issue in China, not simply because it was a strategic opportunity to step ahead of other countries that were lagging, but because China recognizes that this is an existential crisis that it's facing and that the global south as a whole is facing. Now, to put this in context, I would note that my career in the early 90s, I was a public health officer, an environmental public health officer with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, although I started off in infectious diseases. And one of the things that I can tell you, given old context, is that the best science we have suggests, for example, that the pandemic was caused by climate change. That we had models predicting a coronavirus outbreak in 2020. In the literature, it's referred to as disease X, because we had already 3 coronavirus outbreaks that appeared to be correlated with climate change. Those being SARS-1, SARS-2, and MERS. And so we had this model predicting an outbreak in 2020. That's why in October 2019, the CDC delivered to the Trump administration a pandemic control plan, which of course he was unable to put into place for a number of reasons. But the point is, there was research all over the world. This is one of the reasons why Moderna was so ahead in terms of their vaccine development, because this was widely anticipated. Now, whether or not it leaked out of a lab because of all those efforts, or whether or not it was something that originated in nature, the fact of the matter, it was coming, and because we haven't really done anything globally to really deal with climate change so far, we run the risk of being stuck already in a downward spiral that would serve perhaps the strategic interests of someone like Trump, who of course has pretensions now over Canada as well as Greenland and the Arctic, to try to maybe create and extend this global northern preserve for whatever comes down the pike. Now, that's sort of the broader picture, and in this context, I would like to say that India, as we all know, is also tremendously at risk for climate change, as is Brazil and many other countries. So these leading emerging markets, Africa, all of these places, in my understanding as a Marxist internationalist, one of the things we really need to emphasize is internationalism in the global South, focused, if nothing else, on the solidarity of resisting climate change. So that's part one of what I would say. The second thing is, I have the privilege of interacting with Indian diplomats in China, and having candid conversations with them, and candid conversations with people in the Chinese government. And one of the things that I was led to believe is that we might see a breakthrough in China-India relations this month. Unfortunately, whether or not that was true, or whether or not that was hijacked by the conflict between the recent conflict between Pakistan and India, I can't say. But it seems to me that the extent to which China and India can get on the same page is the extent to which we talk about really game over for whatever imperial ambitions the U.S. still has. I think that it would reshape the world. I think it would put an incredible amount of pressure on Japan, Taiwan, others to come together in some sort of Pan-Asian solidarity. And I remain very optimistic for that, despite the fact that clearly it's very easy for some people in India to game this, and certainly easy for some people in Pakistan to game it. And there are people in other countries that likewise have their own reasons to try to disrupt good relations between China and India. But according to what I hear from both sides, the ambition is to improve that relationship, but it is very difficult for them to step past the minefield that lays before them, or that people keep trying to put before them. Now, if you would indulge me just for a couple more moments, I'd like to speak to another issue that relates to all of this, which is it's come to my understanding through the years that there's a profound misunderstanding between the West and China. There's a profound misunderstanding let's just say broadly, a profound misunderstanding. But in addition to this, there's a profound misunderstanding between Marxists who don't understand the Chinese tradition and Chinese Marxists. And I think understanding this, whether you're a Marxist or not, is the key to understanding China today, and the key to building a positive relationship, and even opening the possibility to what President Xi calls a shared future for humanity. And so I don't want to go too far down the path of theory here, but Vijay was talking about Tagore and cultural exchanges. One of the biggest, setting aside tea, of course, one of the biggest cultural exchanges between India and China would be, of course, Buddhism. And here I would really encourage a lot of people to read carefully a very interesting book from the early 1900s, I think 1903, by Kakuzo Okakura, a Japanese scholar. He wrote the book in English. He was living in the United States at that time, and he was constantly being asked, what's the difference between the East and the West? And so he wrote this book called The Book of Tea. And again, given the profound tea culture in India, it should be of interest to Indians just for that reason alone. And maybe many people are already familiar with it. But one of the things that we should say that the two things that Okakura points out is that if you want to understand the difference between the East and the West, and here the East, he means East Asia, not South Asia. He says you need to understand Lao Tzu, or Taoism, and what he refers to as Zen Buddhism, and which in China we would call Chan Buddhism, right? And what's interesting, of course, is that in Lao Tzu we have this very ancient dialectical worldview, which we generally describe as yin-yang thought. And it's not limited to Lao Tzu. We find it in Confucius, we find it in Mozi, we find it in every school of thought that's taken root in China. And we can find it even in ancient Chinese linguistic, in the way they structured characters and created concepts when they first started writing in the middle period of the Shang Dynasty. But the point here is he says, okay, you need to understand Lao Tzu because this is a fundamental difference. And you need to understand Zen Buddhism. And in the case of Zen Buddhism, what we have to do is go back and realize that when Buddhism first came to China from India, it failed. It found some adherents. Certainly it found some people who realized that there was something very useful in Buddhism and that would be of value to people in China. But it did not really spread. And until there was a school called the Flower School, or the Huayan School of Buddhism. And what they did is they took the Lotus Sutra and they interpreted it using Lao Tzu's thought. And in fact, what they did was they brought yin-yang shishyang, or yin-yang thought, into Buddhism, and in this way syncretized it and made it something that would fit the way Chinese people thought. So this is interesting because this idea from Buddhism had to be fundamentally syncretized in order to make sense. And the reason this is significant is because, as many people know, we generally think of India as being the East, but one could also well argue that India is part of the West, in so much as, all but 4 languages in Europe belong to the Indo-European family of languages, with Sanskrit as the root. And one of the things that we find is, of course, that the key value, Immanuel Kant makes this point in the Critique of Pure Reason, and certainly Hegel and Marx are trying to work around this in some way, that the key to enlightenment, to modern science, the Industrial Revolution, in one form or another, is Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. And how that plays forward and is very, of course, different from what we see in terms of Hegelian and Marxist dialectics. Now, there were other previous dialectics. We have Heraclitus, but he ends up being suppressed and all of his works lost. But one of the interesting things is that we find that there is a law of non-contradiction also expressed in the Vedas. In other words, we can go all the way back and find an equivalent of this law. And although we know that Alexander was Aristotle's student, and Alexander was certainly traveled to India and brought back knowledge, there's no evidence that Aristotle, that there was a transmission of that logic or that way of thinking to Aristotle. And so our best guess is that this law of non-contradiction was in some way prefigured linguistically in the language, and that as Aristotle was thinking in Greek, this logic was appearing to him and this was perhaps happening to the ancients in India who were writing the Vedas. But it's, of course, in Buddhism, not to be too reductive, you have this idea of the individual who's not, again, not to reframe it in too modern terminology, but confronting the existential crisis. Whereas in China, the idea of the self was not as robust as what we would find in the Indian tradition or even the Western traditions. People certainly had individual problems, but they didn't perceive these problems as much as individual problems. And this is one of the reasons why Buddhism was going to be so useful, but also why it had to be synthesized in this dialectical way. So the key, just to jump ahead here, is one of the fundamental differences between Chinese Marxism and Soviet Marxism, or Chinese Marxism and all other Marxism, is found in when Mao Zedong is writing on contradiction and on practice in 1937, which of course are influenced with his earlier exchanges with Li Dajiao when he was at the library at Peking University in the late 1919, in that period, 1919, 1920. But the issue is they are bringing this concept of yin-yang thought into the dialectic. And in yin-yang thought, the emphasis is on and, right? And the word for and in Chinese is the same word for harmony. Conversely, in the Western tradition, the focus is on the word or. This is in the law of non-contradiction. But even when you go back and you read Lenin's understanding of dialectics, and Lenin, of course, is really directly taking a page from Engels in this respect. The weight is on or, and this is the fundamental difference. This is why China under Mao can combine the peasants and the working class. Of course, he has to do this tactically, but it's also why he can make sense of it. It's also why China today can have one country, two systems. It's why China can say, okay, emphasize reserve differences, reserve differences by emphasizing common ground, why we should have this understanding of different civilizations, but at the same time build for a shared humanity. In other words, it's an idea of bringing together things in a way that is less ultimately antagonistic. Now, I know that that'll strike some people as odd among those who think they have a keen understanding of Chinese history, but this tradition is the more dominant tradition in Chinese Marxism, and it's the key to understanding Chinese policymaking today as it thinks about the environment, as President Xi has gone back to Lao Tzu and brought the first principle of Taoism, harmony between people and nature, as a key value in Chinese Marxism. And again, I think this is where having this understanding, where India can understand this difference between the cultures in terms of the transmission of Buddhism, as Kokuzo Kokura points out, but also how this very different orientation in Chinese Marxism that emphasizes and more than or, it would open the door, I think, to more fruitful understanding and exchange.
Well, we really have traveled a very large distance. And some of it is very interesting for me because I come, as Vijay knows, from a science and technology background. And I would start, therefore, not because that's central to maybe today's discussions, but on the question of logic that you have raised, essentially the focus on the law of the excluded middle, basically the Aristotelian logic. By the way, this was a major debate in Buddhism as well in India. And in fact, there are those who are extremely strong Aristotelian and those who are against. So it's a debate which has always been there. And it's the same debate as how does the hare overtake the tortoise mathematically? We know it does, but how do you do it mathematically if you have the law of the excluded middle embedded in your system?
And right, also, and I think the point here is that again, we also had the dialectical tradition in ancient Greece with Heraclitus, and certainly we see it arise with Hegel and Marx, but what becomes culturally dominant, what becomes hegemonic, is that Aristotelian tradition. And certainly we can see that counter discourse in Buddhism, but I think what ultimately became, and one can talk about Buddhist dialectics even, certainly in the Tibetan or sense of the word, but what became, I think, dominant is that emphasis on the non-contradiction emphasis.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is we come into this issue mathematically because it's really the mathematicians who are most unhappy if you move away from Aristotle's basic issue of the law of the excluded middle. And we know that dynamics does not obey this law. It really means that you're in two places at the same time, if you will. So we are aware of the contradictions, but unfortunately, mathematicians have not accepted how to modify their mathematics. And that is one of the major debates in what is called, trying to look at many-valued logic. Because as I said, dynamic systems do not obey, quote unquote, the Aristotelian principle. But we'll have to remodel, recast mathematics completely as we know it if we have to deviate from Aristotle, is the argument mathematicians give us why they will not accept it, even though they know there is a problem with it. I'm going to leave it here at the moment and say, yes, of course, historically it is, society is also looking at its own historical experience in order to transform whatever new that comes into being. And that includes Marxism. I just wanted to tell you, even with Indian Buddhism, there is this two strong antipodes, if you will, of how is Buddha dead? How can Buddha be dead? So this is the start of the multi-valued logic in Indian philosophy. So I'm getting into this only because, as I said, it was one of the things that I was involved with in my engineering practice about using many-valued logic and so on. And in actual terms, how to code this into algorithms. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm not going to spend more time on this. Just to say that, yes, I think that opens up a very interesting arena of discussion, how to look at in histories of each of these countries. I'm going to say that I would like to talk about that when we talk about the modern world. We are really looking at the last 500 years in which this so-called age of discovery, enlightenment, industrial revolution, and the dominance of the West is presented as if it rises from essentially age of discovery and enlightenment. And of course, when we know that millions, up to 100 million people maybe were living in the Americas, to argue that few people from Western Europe discovered the Americas itself is a particular construct that is being made. That history as we know it is West European. And anybody who comes into the history, therefore, is basically what they are discovering. And of course, if we take that period, we will see the civilization center was really Asia and also North Africa. These were the civilization center. And that part of Europe, which was in that sense in close proximity to what they would like to call it as Middle East, which is really West Asia for us. And that's the one which is in proximity to Greece, Rome, and so on. And that civilization civilization exchanges took place across the Mediterranean, North Africa, West Asia, East, Greece, Rome. But Western Europe, what emerges out of the colonial experience is something which was outside it. And in fact, we could argue that really they were the barbarians. Now, this transformation of Western Europe to be the center is when Americas come in, and it comes in, unfortunately, with the legacy of genocide and the loot of silver, essentially, which becomes the expansion of the world trade. That suddenly you inject money, free money for Spain, into the global economy to buy what they can. And this 500 years of history, I think, is what we are talking of as coming into a serious contradiction today, as the regions reassert their past in some ways, but their future as equals and free of Western hegemony. And I think that's what is the larger arc of history that I want to talk about a little, not too much, and the fact that technology and science are integral to this. And it's important to understand that the genocide and loot of Americas, in fact, one of the things I think is very important for all of us to understand is Europe's or Western Europe's interaction with the three continents were very different. With Asia, it is one of trade. With Americas, it was genocide and loot, plunder, silver being the most important element of that. And with Africa, basically sub-Saharan Africa, not the African Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa, it was of slavery coupled with genocide, but really slavery. And that is the history, this 100, 200, 300 years of history, which then transformed into what we will call as modern colonialism, when India, as well as China, becomes colonized in different ways. China was not directly colonized, but because it became a kind of neo-colony, if you will, semi-colonial economy, if you will. So this history is based on a history which is forgotten, which is sort of airbrushed out, that this genocide, loot, slavery, and then the plantation economy in which the plantation crops are used by Great Britain at that time to control the global trade. That's how pound becomes the global currency, the international currency. I'm not going to spend time on this and get back to this kind of history. But if we understand this, that what is coming to an end is not 100 years of colonial history, which is what Vijay talked about. And what we are really talking about is this 500 years of colonial history, which finally is coming, that we think, to an end. Of course, when hegemons fall, it also brings about dangers of destructive wars of a kind we have not seen before, and particularly that with nuclear arms that are there currently, it can mean the destruction of civilization or even the human species. So those are the kind of risks which, of course, are also there. But there is no question that we are seeing the end of 500 years of ascendancy of a few countries. And I think Nature is an article which identifies in science there are only 10 countries who contribute journal articles. Only one Asian one, which is China. India is still not there, but not too far behind, but yes, it is not there still. And 9 countries which are there, 8 of them are, of course, from Western Europe. One is, of course, the United States. So this is the kind of dominance which goes back to the kind of loot, genocide, plunder, whatever we want to call it, that took place in the height of colonial empires that the world saw. And the United States, by extension, is really a Western European extension, which becomes the most powerful country in the world because obviously the natural resources they had and the fact they could completely expand into, they claim, was new territory, new territory, of course, which was inhabited by other people, but they could be removed, quote unquote removed. So this history, I think, is what is coming really to an end. And this is why the kind of angst that we see, the combination of, what shall I say, the white resurgence is of really a racial resurgence, which is not looking at a temporary loss of economic or political power, but much more deep-rooted. And if you see that history, it is also built on ethnic violence of different kinds. The genocidal violence which was unleashed in both the Americas and also in Africa, partially, but of course, primarily on the Americas, and of course, the slave economy, modern capitalist slavery that came out of it in terms of being able to till that land and get agriculture out of it, which led to the slave plantations. This history is what I think is coming to an end, and that is why you see the resurgence of different kinds that is taking place. The so-called anti-woke, but essentially a white pride of Mr. Trump that we saw when Cyril Ramaphosa came to visit recently United States. And we saw that white ethnic risk in South Africa being promoted, that there is really a genocide taking place of the whites in South Africa at a time when you have the Palestine every day on our screens. Now, why is it that the idea of genocide was something that wasn't such a big issue when it comes to the Palestinians? Because I do think that the ethnic violence that underlay this history of Western Europe, which of course Germany exhibited as well, the first major ethnic cleansing, if you will, was in Southwest Africa by German colonists who decided they must make this white. And then of the same ideas being exported or imported back to Germany under Nazi Germany. You also had first racial laws passed by actually the Chinese in the United States. I think 1880s, the first anti-China laws were passed that they could not migrate to the United States. The entire, the first racial large-scale laws that were passed in the United States against who could migrate and who could not, the lesser races, so to say, and of course Jews were also included in that, was again in the United States. And Hitler says very clearly that we have learned from the Americans that this whole racial laws that they were introducing, their model was the American laws of the 1920s. So I'm saying is that this racial history is also important for us to understand why European countries, while after 600 days willing to say certain things about Palestine, Israel, but why it took them 600 days when they are supposed to be the ones who after Holocaust said never again. Why is another Holocaust taking place in front of our own eyes is not something which the Europeans are willing to speak up on, except finally now. And I do believe it's because ethnic violence as something which is so deeply embedded in their own history, which they have not confronted, which they have claimed was because the germs killed the indigenous people in the Americas, not us. That this airbrushing of history is something also which underlines what you see as a response, we see as a response to various international events. Coming back to the question that was the organizers have asked, that I do think, therefore, this is both a extremely important event or events that are happening now, that this changing of the world order is not simply the loss of American hegemony, but it is the loss of the hegemony which a few European powers, along with the settler colonial powers, United States, Canada, Australia, have wielded over the world over the last 300 odd years. And this history, which starts 1500 years back, 500 years back, roughly 1500 or so, with Columbus essentially, this history that is coming to an end is what we are seeing now. So I will say in this, India and China are continental-sized economies. The only other continental-sized economies of this kind would be the United States and perhaps Russia, except that Russia, unfortunately, has yet to recover from the fall of Soviet Union and the fact that for some time it thought it would be accepted as a European power, which it was not. And that is finally the realization that the current Russian people are seeming to have. But nevertheless, we will not talk about Russia being at the same level as a civilizational power as, for instance, India and China have been, mainly because of their past history. Past history, the ability to isolate themselves from continuous wars and invasions, and the fact that relative to both these countries, there were strong forces of, what shall I say, historical civilizational forces, like, for instance, Buddhism in India, Taoism, Buddhism in China, which counterbalanced some of the forces that also led to extreme oppression. The caste system in India, the kind of oppression of the peasantry in China. So while all of this, if we take into account, we still have to realize that they were not only civilizational powers, their influence spread to much of other parts of Asia, but also their economy was much larger than most other countries in the world. If you take Angus Madison's calculations, I know that those calculations cannot be talked about rigorously, but if you take them as broad indicators of the economies, then China and India were about 60% of the world's economy till 200 years back. And even then, even after colonization, they remained large economies, India less so, China more so, till industrial revolution takes place, which takes place from the loot of really India. That's what powers the industrial revolution. But without getting further into the historical issue, if I take today, it's what we are seeing is really the restructuring of this world. So when you talk about BRICS coming into being, BRICS does not want to or will not become a military alliance. What it is going to be is to try and see that can countries trade between themselves without the need of an intermediary currency called the dollar. And can they trade in their own currencies? Now, of course, replacement of a global reserve currency is not on the cards immediately. What we're really looking at is bank-to-bank connections using the currencies of a set of countries, not one currency. And I do not think we are going to see, at least in the immediate future, the emergence of an alternative currency. So what Mr. Trump is trying to establish today is that can we use the dollar hegemony and the military hegemony. And the United States military budget is larger than the 9 next countries. So that is the size of the America's military power, if you will, as an indicator. That can he use America's military power and the control over the dollar to extract surplus from each country? And it's for his no exceptions for even his friends, the Europeans, West Europeans, the NATO allies. This is the last, shall we say, the last step the United States as a hegemonic power can take. Because after that, if this fails, and I do believe it's going to fail, there is really nothing left in the kitty for them to say how they can still continue to be number one in the world and how they can control the world. So we are seeing the fall of a hegemon, in the sense the United States emerged as a hegemon after the Second World War, but it was before that itself it had become the major financial power in the world, except the British colonial empire was still there. Once that fell, the United States became the leading economic power in the world. Now, we are seeing an end of that as well. So can they use their dollar and the military hegemony to still control the world is what Mr. Trump seems to be playing. And if that fails, yes, we are going to go through a dangerous moment in history, because nuclear weapons exist and their use will end the world. I think you've also, Gregory, raised the important issue of climate change. And I'm not going to speak about it today because I think that is going to affect the Asia and Africa much more than it will affect Europe. But it's going to affect Europe as well, because ultimately the belief that because European countries and large parts of America are cold, therefore global warming is not going to affect them is completely misunderstanding of basic science. But without getting into that, the question is, that is the belief of a lot of the Western countries' people, that, that global warming would be good for us, our summers would be a little hot, but our winters will not be as cold as it is now. In fact, I had Canadian friends who told me 30 years back, a little global warming would be good for Canada. So these are the kind of, shall I say, misconceptions people have about what global warming would really mean. But yes, it would affect the poorer countries more, simply because they're not resilient in the face of change that can take place. And this is why, of course, the unfortunate part of global warming is it is not going to have an equal impact on all the global countries, but it is going to impact the poorer countries who are less able to take care of themselves even more than the rich countries. So I'm going to stop here on the question of global warming, except to say that let's not forget the global warming issue, climate change issue, also is an energy issue, because the carbon dioxide which is emitted, the major greenhouse gas, is because of the way we use fossil fuels, and also the kind of gas, methane releases that take place from the drilling for gas, oil wells. All these are also extremely potent contributors to global warming. And this is the other part, that if you want to switch to renewables, of course, the sun being the most obvious one, then there is a huge infrastructure you need to build. And that infrastructure, China has built, India is trying to build it now, but it's very difficult for a lot of the poor countries to build. And that is why the United States is saying, we don't care about that. We are going to still drill for oil, because we are going to use gas, because we are not going to change our basic lifestyle. This was, I think, George Bush saying that our lifestyles are not for discussion. So this is the other part of the climate change issue, which I'm not, as I said, going to discuss. that how do we meet the demands of cutting down fossil fuels with the need for energy justice, as well as, of course, larger economic justice, is the question that comes up on on climate change issues. So it's not just climate, we also need to think about energy, without which no modern society can survive. I'm going to end here. I think we have a lot of, we have spent a lot more than our quota. It's gone on for almost 1.5 hours. So I'm going to end here, thanking both Vijay and Gregory for being with us, spending their valuable time and illuminating a lot of the issues that are confronting all of us. I apologize to the organizers for having spoken a little more than perhaps our quota was. Thank you, all of you, and hope to see you again.
Thanks a lot.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with the latest incidents. Hit the bell icon to never miss an update. We will see you next time with more news that matters. Stay informed, stay safe.